Today I'm going to tell a little story about collecting and what I think it's all about. While I tell this story, let's look at footage I shot at a 1995 radio swap meet. But note that nobody in this story has anything to do with anybody you may see in this video. Back in 1990, the collecting of early transistor radios had begun in earnest by a handful of so-disposed goofballs, including me. Before this, these old radios were generally considered worthless, and that judgment persisted. Even at the time we began collecting them, more of these radios were probably being thrown out every day than were being collected by the few of us collecting them. It was sort of a race to raise awareness of their value to us among what are called pickers, and those people who acquire things in various ways and sell them at flea markets. The trick was to raise awareness enough that the radios got found and saved and offered to us, but not too much that they attracted more potential collectors to compete with us and raised the prices. Most of the handful of us collecting knew each other, and I don't know when I've enjoyed myself more than in those early days, talking at length, sometimes at absurd length, with those other collectors in person or on the phone. The early transistor radio collectors I knew of were in California, Arizona, New York, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida. In these radio conversations, we would discuss our latest finds and all the details about the brands and models and what we'd learned and what we'd figured out from what we learned, about who made what and when, and what it meant. And it meant a lot to us. Sometimes we'd make photocopies of radios and mail them to each other. We'd just put a radio face down on a Xerox machine and make a copy. My point is, we shared. That was where the fun was in this. We shared, all learning together about a thing that grew increasingly interesting the more we learned. One day back then, at a radio swap meet in Southern California, much like the one shown here, but several years earlier, when there were very few transistor radios for sale, a seller showed up with about 30 or so really prized ones, rare ones in great shape. Usually the sellers at these radio meets would have a maximum of 5 transistor radios, if they had any at all, and most of them would be newish and ugly. But here were 30 early ones for sale, and all good ones, and they were expensive. He knew what he had. So I start to zero in on what he had that I wanted most, and engage him in some conversation about the radios. He obviously was a collector, like the several others with which I enjoyed discussing these things, so here was very likely a new member to our ranks. As I asked him questions about the radios he was selling, he responded with generic sort of non-answers. So I began sharing what I knew and attempting to start a back and forth, as anyone would do, letting him know I was a serious buyer and had some knowledge myself I was more than happy to share. But still his responses were substance-free. After several minutes of this, finally I came right out and asked him, "How long have you been collecting?" "A while," he says. So I asked him, "Do you have a Regency TR1? That was a defining question back then. Few of us had a Regency TR1, so I asked him, and do you know what his answer was to that? He said, "That's information." "Huh?" I said. And I asked him again about the Regency. "That's information," he said. And as I stood there trying to figure out what that meant, another guy, another collector I knew, came up to look at his radios and basically repeated what I had done, attempting to engage and maybe do a little commerce. And sure enough, the seller's responses to him were the same as to me. And after a while, the same dead end was reached. That's information. Now, none of us ever saw this guy again. We learned that he was from up north, around San Francisco, and that he was one of those young Silicon Valley guys, a mover and shaker in the early dot-com boom of the 1990s. And that's how I finally pieced together the meaning of "that's information." He was one of those people building the so-called information economy. He and guys and gals like him were creating the information age. To him, information didn't exist to be shared, it existed to be sold. And he wasn't going to give any away. Though obviously a collector himself, he would have no part in the camaraderie of other collectors. Of course, that is his right. But how sad. I'm sure he is a billionaire by now, gathering your information online and selling it to advertisers. How nice for him. I think collecting is about sharing. For me, that's where the fun is. That's what I'm doing here on YouTube, sharing. But there are collectors for whom that is not so. When one of these people gets a prized item, when I hear that they've scored some highly desired rarity, I'd like to feel happy for them, but instead I just feel disappointment. Why? Because I would like to have had the item? No. Well, of course I would like to have had it, but that's not why the disappointment. The disappointment is in knowing that it will be squirreled away, and none of us will ever see it. There will be no pictures shared, no video, no information. What the item might have to teach us, and how it might help inform the collecting in which the rest of us are collectively engaged, is not going to be known. It's not going to happen. Oh well, that is their right. That's information.